Good morning, this is your Biznation Bulletin with me, Henry Winter. And first, the UK Chancellor Rishi Sunak delivered his spending review on Wednesday against a backdrop of difficult economic data, with the country's economy set to shrink by 11.3% this year. Sunak's used the government chequebook on multiple occasions this year, forking out £280 billion on measures to fight the virus and its impact on the economy. And this is all adding to the UK's ever-growing budget deficit, which was more than £260 billion between April and October alone. A budget deficit occurs when government spending is greater than tax revenues. Reducing the deficit can be achieved by tax increases or cuts in government spending, or a period of GDP growth which brings about a rise in direct and indirect tax revenues. Importantly, the deficit is different to debt, which is the amount owed. Running multiple budget deficits will cause debt to grow, whereas running a surplus will cause it to shrink. This trend isn't over yet, though, as schools, hospitals and police are set to receive a funding boost next year, but it was clear from the address that it can't go on forever. Borrowing is expected to reach £394 billion for the current fiscal year, which will end in April. And in order to fill the ever-growing hole in the government's finances, Sunak's announced a freeze in pay rises for many public sector workers and cuts to overseas aid. And with the pandemic very much in full flow, Mr. Sunak will no doubt be hoping vaccines are approved and distributed as soon as possible, as it appears keeping the balance between helping the economy and keeping the government's finances in order is becoming ever more difficult. The Dow Jones Industrial Average reached a record high this week, surpassing the milestone level of 30,000 points. The Dow Jones Industrial Average is a stock market index that tracks 30 large publicly owned blue chip companies trading on the New York Stock Exchange and the Nasdaq. The index is seen as a bellwether of corporate America, but is sometimes regarded as less representative than alternative indices such as the S&P 500 or Russell 3000, which cover a larger number of companies. Financial media went wild on the news, with CNBC's Mad Money host Jim Cramer declaring that happy days are here again. Donald Trump even went so far as to describe the 30k figure as sacred. Well, it's certainly been a wild ride for the Dow this year. It actually dipped below 20,000 points back in March, before coming back with a vengeance, buoyed by unprecedented levels of monetary and fiscal stimulus, and more recently, a reprieve from US election uncertainty and positive vaccine news. The 30k figure may not have much tangible value, as the Dow is just an index after all, but given the scrutiny and attention it attracts, it definitely gives an indication that investors are in high spirits going into the new year. We're delighted to say we've got some more good vaccine news this week. Astrazeneca and Oxford University followed in the footsteps of Pfizer and Moderna, announcing the results from their late-stage trials. This vaccine has been given a 70% average effectiveness. Why the average? Well, it was found that when a participant received 2 full doses 1 month apart, it was 62% effective, but that increased to 90% when a half dose was followed by a full dose. If given the nod from regulators, AstraZeneca says it can produce 3 billion doses next year. Despite it being less effective than the ones we've already heard about, people are very excited about this one because it can be stored at fridge temperatures for at least 6 months, making it easier to distribute. What's more, AstraZeneca doesn't plan on profiting, and so it'll only cost a few quid, meaning developing nations should be able to afford it. Looking at the markets, they stayed quite flat on the announcement, and actually the FTSE closed ever so slightly down on Monday. This suggests the market is already pricing in good vaccine news, so they weren't really that bothered. Now, it is important to know that this story is ongoing, but at the time of recording, it's Biznation's understanding that AstraZeneca may be performing a new trial to validate the result of the lower dose, which performed better. It seems there is no stopping Elon Musk at the minute. After sending astronauts to the International Space Station last week, he just surpassed Bill Gates as the world's second richest man. As you may remember last week, S&P Global announced Tesla would be joining the S&P 500 in December, which sent shares soaring. And when Tesla's share price soars, so does the value of Musk's personal stake in the company. He owns around 20%. The shares are now valued at around £390, which is roughly a 700% rise since this time last year. Musk is therefore now worth an estimated £100 billion. And finally, what's the longest you've ever queued for a burger? An hour, maybe 2? Well, for some Colorado diners, they can now answer that question with a whopping 12 hours. That's right, the first 2 In-N-Out burger locations opened in the state last Friday, and thousands queued up to grab a bite. It turns out Americans really like food. Shock. So these guys that queued, they could have travelled to the restaurant in another state, travelled back, and watched a feature-length film in the time it took them to queue and get one in Colorado. I mean, it would be a bit pricey, but I imagine if you're a person that's happy to queue 12 hours for a burger, you're probably happy to do that as well. Well, that's all your Biznation news for this week. Thanks for tuning in, and we'll see you again next time. Bye-bye.